Hi, welcome to StatStuff. I'm Matt Hansen. In this lesson, we'll review some examples of how you can effectively communicate the progress of a project by building a project storyboard. There are no prerequisite lessons for this lesson, so we'll dive right into it first by defining what is a project storyboard. When you think of a storyboard, you might normally think of the kind of storyboard that's used for films, like a director who might plan out the story for all the different scenes and the dialogue associated with all the scenes, or the angles or the visuals for what they're going to be filming in each of those scenes, and they lay out the story in what they call a storyboard. Well, when we talk about a project storyboard, it's not that very different from that same kind of example. It's basically a document where you're going to use that to communicate the story of your project. Typically it might be in something like in a Microsoft PowerPoint set of slides where you use that document to tell your story. But the point of it is that the storyboard is supposed to tell the premise, the analysis, and any results that were done within the project, as far as summarizing it in that way, so that you're communicating all that happened within the actual project itself. Now, you can use this kind of storyboard throughout the project. You can use it from the very beginning when you're starting the project all the way throughout the project, and use it afterwards after the project is complete. I often do that because I like to have something that I update regularly that's constantly telling the story, because I find myself having to communicate with others, even in the middle of the project, to communicate with them the progress that they have so far. So I use a storyboard to help communicate that. Now, because of that, you can find that the story is going to change throughout the duration of the project. Now, if you find it's going to change, then that means the storyboard itself should be changing. So don't be afraid if you're going to have to add or delete or modify certain parts of the storyboard in order to enhance the overall story of the project that you're trying to communicate. The whole point of this is that you're intending to communicate some story or to get some sort of message across to your audience, those who are listening to your story. Usually it could be for getting buy-in from a sponsor, or you're trying to get some support or some agreement to some proposal, or you just want to be able to brag about what the team has done and how successful the project was. Whatever it is, whatever your story is that you're trying to tell, make sure you have a clear understanding of who your audience is and what you're trying to communicate to them. And this storyboard should emphasize whatever that primary story is you're trying to get across to your audience, so that they do agree, or they have some buy-in, or they appreciate at least the contributions you made and how you communicated it through the success of the project. Again, whatever the story is, you got to make sure that you keep that story succinct and you keep it consistent as you're laying it out in the storyboard. Now, as far as for a method or the style that you use for the storyboard itself, there is no official or formal method that's used. It's pretty open. There are some organizations that, when you have a Lean or Six Sigma organization set up within a company, very often they might have their own format for how they want a storyboard to be created. So if they have something like that where you are, then you need to be consistent with what they'll allow. But also, some organizations do offer the ability for people to be flexible in how they create their storyboard. So I generally prefer to be more creative in that sense, where I don't like to be forced to follow a certain model if it happens to be inconsistent with the story that I'm trying to tell. So I like the flexibility and creativity I can lend to actually telling the story in the way that I want to tell it. But that's what's most critical, that you try to build your story in a way that makes it easy for you to communicate the message to your audience. So, although there may not be a formal layout that's required, again, you want to use whatever is easiest for you as you're trying to communicate that story to your audience. One of the things I recommend is the common thing of the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid. That is where you target the language and all the concepts, everything that you're communicating within your storyboard, to like a 6th grade level. Someone who doesn't necessarily have the full context, or may not have the language of somebody who's college educated, and that's okay. I usually prefer myself to keep it simple, keep it basic, and don't assume a prior knowledge from the audience. Generally, the audience is not going to have all the same knowledge, and that's okay. I usually like to communicate it at a more fundamental level for them, just in case there is someone who doesn't have that same kind of knowledge that I might normally expect. Now, if there are any key terms or acronyms or concepts that are communicated, then I usually like to explain those along the way. I like to either just explain what an acronym is, then I can use the acronym through the rest of the storyboard from beyond that point, or rather than just assuming that the folks or whom I'm communicating with, rather than assuming that they already know what those acronyms mean. So just be sensitive to that. If you have something like that, it's good to at least explain them up front, or you can add a glossary to the back of the storyboard, like in an appendix, where you can explain all the definitions in a one-page document at the end of the storyboard that just says, here are all the terms that I'm using, and here's the definition of each of those terms. I like using a lot of pictures or charts or some sort of visuals to help explain any critical concepts that I'm trying to communicate to my audience. So if you have that opportunity, I strongly recommend that you try to use some sort of visuals to communicate it. If there's clip art that you're using, I don't mean visuals like clip art where there's little fancy pictures of little people or things like that you might find on some documents. I would only use clip art or things like that, those kinds of images, only if it's relevant to the story you're trying to tell, only if it helps communicate that story further. Sometimes it just takes away and it's distracting, and sometimes it's used just to fill up the white space. Honestly, sometimes I prefer to just keep the white space on there so that way it's less distracting. But if there is something that is relevant to the story you're trying to tell, then absolutely try to use it. Now, if there are complex statistical tools that are necessary for you to use in communicating the analysis maybe that was done within the project, then try to simplify those as much as possible. Leave the complexity in your back room area where you actually perform the analysis, but when you're presenting it and communicating it to an audience, try to keep it as simple as possible. I rarely will use the full-fledged statistical tools and charts that are usually used in some of that software to show what the analysis was. I usually like to simplify it completely and let the audience actually just see the results of the analysis that was done, but they don't have to necessarily see that it came from my statistical software that I used. So I usually will not include that. I also recommend that you use the kill method, which is keeping it logical. I like to make sure that the flow of the story is logical and that the flow is consistent, that if there's a message or some method that's used in how you communicate it, that you try to be consistent with that method, and that it follows a logical order in the way that your audience normally might think about something. So if you present a certain situation or concept or something critical in the analysis that you're presenting, and you're thinking your audience is probably going to ask certain questions, or they have certain hurdles or pitfalls about the situation at hand, then address it at that moment when you think they're facing it. That way you're answering their questions, or you're anticipating their questions and trying to answer it along the way, and you're following that logical flow that in the way that it might normally think. It'll make it a lot easier for them. If there's any part that does not make sense, it doesn't follow a logical order, then you're probably better off just excluding it from the story altogether. Some tips I would offer for building a storyboard is to keep your main points of the story at the front of the storyboard. Keep them right up front, and if there's any information that is detailed or nice to know but not necessarily relevant to the story, then leave that in the appendix if you have to include it at all. But I like to keep all the points short and sweet and right up front in the main part of the storyboard, so that's the key thing that I'm trying to leave with my audience. Also, I like using the example of a question-answer format, where I ask a question and I let the rest of the slide that I'm using for that particular page answer that question. And that way it lets the audience know that you're trying to answer this particular question, so they know what you're trying to communicate to them. That format tends to work well for me, and that's where I'm comfortable with. So if you happen to feel comfortable using that same type of format, then I would strongly recommend it. But again, I would prefer that you use whatever method is you're most comfortable with and how you communicate to your audience. This just happens to be one of the ones that I find most effective for me and how I communicate. Also, I recommend adding an executive summary. A lot of folks expect and want to see an executive summary. What I like to do usually is put it on the front page of the storyboard itself. That is, on the cover page. Sometimes I'll just throw a few bullets on the very front just so I can get the executive summary right in the very front, rather than dedicating a whole separate page to it. I know that tends to be the old school way when you have an executive summary. Quite honestly, that's just filling space, and I'd rather make the set of slides and the whole story shorter, make it look less intimidating when there's less of a stack of paper in front of the audience, and that way One way of doing that is to add the executive summary actually to the very cover page itself. And I'll walk through a couple examples of where I've done that. Also, I like to add sometimes a takeaway or some bottom line or some comment or note on a lot of the slides that basically says, you know what, there's a lot of information communicated on this slide. Here's the takeaway. This is what you should remember from this particular slide. This is what it's trying to say. I find that sometimes that's very helpful because it gets right to the point of what I want them to remember and of what that particular slide is trying to say. Now let's look at several examples of project storyboards that I've used in prior projects. Now all these examples that I'm about to show you are real-world projects that I had worked in the past. What you'll notice is you'll get to see some of my style that I tend to use on a storyboard, but again, there's no perfect storyboard that's created. There are just ones that are better or maybe worse at communicating to your audience. This just happens to be the style I tend to use when I try to communicate to my audience. So feel free to borrow from any of the examples that I use and the style that I use, because I probably borrowed them from somebody else myself. So one of the first examples I'll show is one where I supported a back office area and looked at seeing how we can streamline and identify some issues in the processes within a particular back office area. What we found is there are actually 6 different opportunities that we're looking at, and we use the IPO FAT tool to help identify those particular opportunities. The IPO FAT tool is a separate tool that was covered on a separate lesson and goes into a lot more detail in a separate video, but for now I'll just show you the examples of how these storyboards were created. So in this particular storyboard, I've got here the first page, and then the first page, that cover page, you can see I just have a brief executive summary that was outlined on there. Then on my second page, what I added here was an introduction to Lean and Six Sigma. I used this because I knew my audience may not be familiar with Lean and Six Sigma. And in particular, I knew they probably weren't going to be familiar with the IPO FAT tool. That's this matrix that's down here in the bottom half of this second page. Well, I wanted to communicate that to them because that was a critical tool that was used for identifying these opportunities and prioritizing them. It was also a method that I used in how I communicated the rest of the story. So I knew right up front I wanted to make sure my audience was familiar with this tool and how it was used. So I hit them right up front with explaining that in case they weren't already familiar with it. Now on the next page, what I get into is just our project charter. So this is where I get into like a background statement, which is the setting the context for the project itself. Then I get into the problem statement. Then I get into defining the scope and who the team is. I like just getting quickly and briefly to the point on this particular slide where I can address the critical parts of the project, again to help set the context, and most importantly to help explain why this is even a project in the first place. What are these symptoms as we communicated in the problem statement itself. Next, in the next page, this is where I get into where I've taken the IPO FAT tool itself and I outline how we use this tool to identify those 6 different opportunities that we found in this particular project. So I used the layout of the IPO FAT tool, same matrix here, but instead of the typical questions and things that are used within the IPO FAT tool itself, I removed those and instead embedded within them the 6 different items for the different areas where those opportunities were found. And this is what laid for us the foundation of how we're going to prioritize and looking at these opportunities. Now they're all numbered in here. It's a little difficult to see at this level, and that's okay. Just know that the different opportunities are numbered in here 1 through 6. So what I did next to communicate what we did for each of those opportunities is I laid out 1 page for each opportunity. So the next 6 pages covered all 6 of those different opportunities, and each page I tried to be consistent in the method of how the pages were laid out. That is, each page had this same IPO FAT tool in the upper right corner where I just showed and highlighted which particular opportunity this was referring to among the entire set of opportunities that were outlined in the IPO FAT tool earlier. So I use that as a consistent guide so they can see where this fits in among all the other opportunities that we've discussed. For each of these opportunities on each of these pages, I tried to use the same consistent language as well. What's the problem? What's the impact or the risk that's being felt for the performance metrics from that problem? What's the root cause? What were the improvements? And what are the results? I don't get into the whole lot of the detail about following the DMAIC methodology and following the statistical analysis that was used. That was all done in the background for this particular project, so I didn't see a need to have to communicate that to the audience. I didn't have to explain that. I just wanted to hit them up with each opportunity. Here's the problem, here's the root cause we found, the improvements we put in place, and the results. For each of these as well, when possible, I try to communicate some visual, something that showed here's where we were, then here's the line of demarcation where we implemented the improvement, and you can see the dramatic reduction and improvement in whatever this particular issue was. So that's how I try to be consistent in communicating that same message, again, across these 6 different opportunities. By using this method, it made it so much easier to communicate to my audience, because once they saw the first page, then when they saw the second one, they were already familiar with the structure of that page. And it was a whole lot easier for them to not have to get acclimated to how I'm trying to communicate. They can then focus on the content itself, because it was only the content that was changing. The rest of the questions and layout was pretty consistent. So it really helped in communicating that part of the story. Then that was the entire set of slides that I used for the storyboard. What I also added was, in the appendix, I showed the charts like a process map of an as-is and to-be process map, and this was for only one of those opportunities. It was a critical one of the critical opportunities, and I thought it was critical to at least include this comparison of the as-is and to-be process maps, because it was so essential to what we were trying to show as the value contributed from that particular opportunity and the improvements we made there. But I threw it in the appendix because it may not be part of our discussion. It wasn't as necessary to the story, but at least I had it available in case my audience wanted to ask about it. And then last, I added the control plan. This is the whole thing that put all 6 opportunities identified in one page and outlined for us exactly what we were going to do next, how we can make sure that these improvements stay in place. It's a critical part of the control phase for having this type of tool. But I thought, again, this wasn't something I had to have as part of my story, but if my audience was interested in knowing how we're going to make sure the improvements are sustained, this was my tool that I can illustrate and have on hand in the appendix to help communicate that. In this next example, it was for a call reduction project. That is, we were trying to find ways that we can significantly reduce the call volume for one particular call center. And the findings that we would have from that is something we can leverage to other call centers. So when we started off with this and communicating it, as is typical for the way that I would do it, my cover page again was just real simple, and I also identified on here an executive summary for the key points that I wanted my audience to know. And then my second page, this is where my project charter is, where I had a simple 1-sentence problem statement, and also identifying the objective for what we're trying to accomplish within the project, along with the scope and the project team. Again, I tried to get right to the point so they understand the context for why this is an important project. The next 2 slides were basically just addressing what were the improvements and the results that we saw in the project, and the other questions that they might have about those improvements. Now, in this example, I did not go through the entire story. I purposely did not try to lay out how we went from beginning to end through trying to identify the improvements. To me, the audience and who I was trying to communicate this to didn't care about that. They just wanted to know what were the results. So this is more of a after the fact kind of storyboard that showed here are the results of what we've done. Now, if they wanted to ask more questions about that, I'd be able to pull out my information in my back pocket as far as the tools that we used and all the detailed analysis. But it wasn't something I thought that was necessary to communicate up front in this kind of storyboard. So I dedicated this 3rd page here to just communicate what are the improvements. And in those improvements, I identified 4 different improvements we put in place, and it's laid out over a timeline. And in the timeline, I'm tracking the actual metrics. They can see how the metric had performed over that same time. And I also marked those 4 different parts in time where those improvements were laid out and where they were implemented. So that way they can see how the metrics changed with the implementation of each of those improvements. And then there were some additional questions that came up as well that we knew might be relevant, because we wanted to make sure our audience knew that this wasn't just a fluke for the improvements that we saw, but I anticipated they might be asking, well, isn't this something we might have experienced at other call centers? How do we know that what we did was actually making a true difference? So this was the set of the slide that I used and the set of charts I used to help communicate that the improvements that we saw at this site were very significant, and we can directly tie the two to the improvements that we had implemented. So we knew that it wasn't just a fluke that happened across all of our different call centers. And finally, I ended the storyboard with just showing the recommendation that we had. We recommended 3 basic steps that we wanted to have our audience buy into so they can implement this at a different level. Now, when I first laid this out, one thing I'd like to point out is there's really no visuals on this, but it looks like they're visuals simply because of the way I laid out these 3 boxes. Now, when I first drew this slide up, all I had were these items listed as 3 different bullets. Here's the first step, second step, and the third step, and each of those listed with their own set of sub-bullets as well. When I looked at the overall slide, it was just nothing but text. And honestly, I usually don't like slides that have a lot of text. I like visuals, or at least where the eye is drawn to some sort of visual to help break things apart. So it's a little easier for the reader to read it and not be intimidated by so much text and getting lost among the text. So I just took those 3 key points, the 3 simple steps I wanted to communicate, and I laid those out in just these colored boxes like this with the sub-bullets just adding the detail for each of those steps. And that was enough. It was enough that the audience can look at these and get the point. These are the 3 things they're following in left to right in order, so it made sense to them. So it gave the appearance of seeming like it's visual when really it's not. I tend to use this a lot. It's a very effective method for, again, breaking apart your slides and making sure that your audience isn't getting lost. I want them to follow what I'm trying to tell them, to follow the story, and buy into the message I'm trying to give them. So if I can make it as easy as possible, I'll do whatever I can, so that way I can get the support that I need in how I'm trying to communicate for that particular project. In this next example, this is where we were doing analysis on what's called the Repeat Caller Alert, or RCA. Now, this particular analysis wasn't something that was a full DMAIC project. It was more just of analysis that somebody was asking about this particular indicator we had in our software in support of some of our call centers, and they wanted to understand, is this really making a difference? Is this particular RCA factor really making a difference and contributing some improvements as we were expecting? So even though it didn't follow the full DMAIC flow of a project, I still like to communicate it as a storyboard because there's still a story to tell. So I still like to follow that format even if it's not a full DMAIC project. So what I did in this one, again, I've got the cover page on there, and then I hit them with my next page with the same project charter elements of describing like a background of what the RCA is and what the problem statement is. Now in this page also I identify the strategy of how we were going to do this analysis, and I break it down in here to 3 basic questions that we wanted to ask. So this was the strategy. We're going to try to answer those 3 basic questions so that way the audience knows this is what we're trying to answer as we work through this analysis. So the next set of slides were just to show how we were going to answer those 3 same questions. Now the information that we had as a result, it looked like it was very jumbled up and it was very complex. So rather than just taking the audience directly to the complex information and the answer to all those questions, we kind of spoon-fed them one step of the way. So you can see in here we just took the first question and we just answered it with a simple pie chart, just showing the breakdown for what we were trying to answer in that question. Then we took the second question and we kept the same format and style as where the first one was, and even kind of shaded out the first one. It's still there, still visible to the audience, but now we're just emphasizing we're taking this one step further to the second question that we were asking. But now here's the answer to that second question. Then we added a third one. Here's the third question, the third and last question we were trying to answer, and again we added more detail to the same pie chart. So we're kind of building on it. Then this was that last slide. This was what for us was the money slide, the slide that had all the answers and the results of what we were trying to communicate to our audience. Now again, if we just started with this slide and stuck with this one alone, then the audience might have been lost in the busyness of all these different boxes and how it was laid out. So instead, to help tell the story just one step at a time, we started off again with just one question, then building each question at a time, continuing to build the story one page at a time. And it just made it a lot easier and smoother to communicate that to the audience. Then after that, we just had an additional slide that was getting into the basis for those results and what we would expect to do from that point further. The other effects that we would see from that particular analysis and the results we saw. And we used the min-max analysis, which is another video that we get into, but a way for us to see whether this was really a worthy opportunity or not based off of the findings that we had. then we finally just ended it with a conclusion and some recommendation for the next steps. I always like to leave something for the audience so that way I can tell them, this is the conclusion we're expecting from this. Here's what we're recommending. Do you agree? And here are the next steps. I don't like to usually leave it to the audience to come up with that, although they can naturally come to their own different conclusions, come up with different suggestions, and take different actions. I usually like to have something laid out for them up front. So that way if they just were anticipating what to do next, I've got some solution, something for them to work with. And I usually prefer to do that kind of format. And again, if they wanted to do something different, come to a different conclusion, then they still can do that, but I like to offer something to them instead. In this last storyboard example, it was for a project for a transportation company, and in that particular project they were trying to reduce the number of what they called road empty miles. So this is more of a formal, a much more comprehensive layout for a storyboard that I built, and it's not necessarily something as quick and flexible and dynamic like the other ones that I've shown that are much briefer, but this is a much more formal in its layout and how it was designed to communicate the DMAIC methodology that was applied to this one. So I'll show you at least the first few sets of slides and you hopefully can get the idea from there. So it started off with, again, the basic cover page, and also because it was a lot more complex and comprehensive with the information in there, I also included a kind of like a table of contents so they can see, they can flip right to the page within the story of where they wanted to jump to. And I also include an explanation of Lean and Six Sigma and the DMAIC methodology that we use as a way to let them know this is what we applied. Since I'm going to be using some of those terms and concepts to explain the story, I wanted to give that information to them up front if they weren't familiar with it already. So from there we started off, we'll say, with just the define phase. Like in the define phase we hit the critical elements that you might expect to see in the define phase, like the ARMI, which is like the stakeholder analysis, the elements of a project charter, defining the problem and some of the goals, the scope, what's included, what's excluded, and also a high-level process map. Again, those key elements that you'd expect to see in a typical define phase are the ways that we just kind of laid that out. And again, at the front of this section for the define phase, again, we've got another set of table of contents so they can see what to expect in the coming pages. And then beyond that, we moved on to like the measure phase. And in the measure phase, again, address some of the key points in there, defining, showing how we define some of the defects and how we laid into our data collection and identifying where within the business we had our plan for how we're going to collect the data and how we can trust that particular type of data, and starting to size up the opportunity and the capability itself within what we're collecting. Well, these were the elements again of like the measure phase, and so it just continued on with the analysis and analyze, improve, and control phases as well. But we also include some additional elements in here that helped explain to the audience, again using lots of visuals to help communicate to them what road empties means, what these road empty miles means, and how we can illustrate it so the audience understands it in case the audience isn't familiar with it. And then use some practical examples here of when there was some actual driving and the actual savings in the miles, the reduction of miles we could expect if we were to able to identify these defects and help reduce those defects. So again, all these elements were just elements that helped communicate to the audience the details of this project, and it went to a whole lot more detail than the other types, but again, it depends on the audience you're trying to communicate with. So sometimes you just want to get quick to the point and explain to the audience, here are the improvements that we had, here are the results. Or you might want to get into something much more detailed like this, where you want to explain your whole method from beginning to the end of how you walk through an entire project and work through your entire analysis. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this for every project at this level of detail, but again, use your best judgment to determine what your audience wants to hear and how you're going to communicate this, and try to target your storyboard in that direction to support your audience.
Alright, before we close this lesson, let's discuss how we can apply some of these concepts in a practical way.
What I'd like you to do is think about some examples of project storyboards that maybe you've done, or maybe the other examples of storyboards that other people have done. And in what ways were those particular storyboards effective? And in what ways did you find that maybe they were not effective? And for the audience that they were communicating to, did the audience respond to the message of that storyboard as the author was intending, either that you or the person who actually created it? Did the audience really respond in the way that they were hoping? Did they, that is, if they were looking for buy-in, did they actually buy into the message? Or did you find that the audience was actually having difficulty in understanding something that was communicated in the storyboard and there was some gap in how it was communicated? So if not, then how could that storyboard have been more effective in communicating to that audience? And then finally, what are some of the storyboard tips or techniques, either that we showed today or in the other examples that were provided? What are some of those things that you think might be helpful in your future storyboards that you might be creating?
Well, that wraps up this lesson. Check out StatStuff.com for many more resources that can help you achieve powerful results. I'm Matt Hanson. Thanks for watching.